Gentlemen, thank you so much. We have gotten through our first 10 minutes each of opening comments for Is Jesus the Prophet of Islam? And before we go any further, we're going to take a break, but we're going to actually go to our studio again to our friends Diana and CL. And can we get a vision? There we go. How are you?
Doing well. We are doing well.
I'll just turn it over to you.
Yes, it has been a very excellent and great debate so far. You witnessed the first debate between Shabir Ali and David Wood, which asked the question, was Jesus the Son of God? A very important question. And now you're listening to the second debate. The second question is Jesus a prophet of Islam? Great answer, great debates, great questions, and great claims and arguments so far.
And we are back, and thank you so much for staying with us. We're excited as we continue to move forward with our debate here. And again, the topic of this particular debate this afternoon is Jesus a prophet of Islam? And we left off with each gentleman having their opportunity to give their 10-minute opening statement. Right now, Dr. Shabir Ali has a 7-minute time of 7 minutes, let's just say it that way, to do the first rebuttal.
Sure.
Right ahead.
Okay. So David's presentation was very interesting. It seems that he was very well organized. He had his points in his laptop. He can just read them off very rapidly, and that was very interesting to see him do that. But in all of this, I find that there's a lack of critical thinking on the part of David. Though he's very critical of Islam, but when it comes to examining his sources and trying to find out for himself who Jesus was for Christians of today, he doesn't have any critical thinking. For example, he has clearly agreed that the earliest writings were not the four Gospels that we have now in our Christian Bibles. And yet he does not try to see how to retrace the steps and find out who Jesus was before these Gospels were written. He does not try to follow my prompts and see how Matthew and Luke changed the story from the way it was in Mark, and how John changed the story even further. He continues to cite from these Gospels as though everything in all of these Gospels are absolutely true. And that shows an actual absolute lack of critical thinking. For example, he cites a lot from Matthew's Gospel, from John's Gospel, to show that Jesus was Lord of the Sabbath, or Lord of King David, or Final Judge, or he answers prayer, for example, in John's Gospel, or that he's with his followers always in Matthew's Gospel. But where's the critical thinking that says, let's go back, trace them over history. How did it go from Mark, where Jesus was obviously a human being, having limitations, sometimes he didn't know things, and how does that go to the extent that he's answering prayers in the Gospel according to John? How does it go from simple son to only begotten son? And what was there before Mark's Gospel? How was the story changed from the way it was before to the way it comes to be entered in Mark? How was it before even Paul? Because Paul's writings that we have now were written in the 50s and early 60s. And Jesus was said to be crucified in year 30 or 33. So Paul was writing some 20 years after the fact. What went by during those 20 years? Even the Gospel Q was written 20 years after the fact by some anonymous person. So the Quran is actually taking us back to that original phase, and I've shown the development by case after case. There's not one or two instances, but this is a continuing story. We see the development of Christian doctrine being reflected in the Gospels and being put back into the mouth of Jesus, as if Jesus was teaching what Christians arrived at in the later decades of the first century, especially as put now in the Gospel according to John. So we have to be critical and differentiate between wheat and chaff. David has to do this for his own sake, because if he wants to be a true follower of Jesus, he has to discover the true Jesus as he was and as he walked on the earth, not as later Gospel writers and preachers represented him to be. So when we see, for example, that Luke says that he is depending on witnesses, David actually did not quote fully what Luke said. Luke says not only the eyewitnesses, but also ministers of the word. So there were people who were eyewitnesses, and then there were people who preached the word. And Luke is relying on both. And we know how preachers bend things in order to prove their own points when they're making them. And we don't know who were these eyewitnesses and who were these preachers of the word that Luke was depending on. So all of this is majhul, anonymous. We don't know who are the authorities and whether they were inspired men or not. And Luke himself does not claim to be inspired. So we have to go back and look at these documents in a critical way. Now, was the God deceptive? In quoting the verse from the Quran that deals with the crucifixion of Jesus, David mixed in the commentaries as though it is part of the verse itself. But the verse does not actually say that somebody else was made to look like Jesus and put on the cross instead. This is a common commentary. It is a very classical commentary. It is almost ubiquitous in the ancient commentaries. However, the verse itself does not need to mean all that. The verse could simply mean that though the enemies of Jesus thought that they had crucified him, they did not succeed in their attempt to crucify him. It appeared as though they were succeeding, but they did not. And God rescued Jesus and raised him to himself, but they were in doubt concerning the matter. And we see the doubt that is expressed in the Gospels themselves, and later Gospel writers trying to fix that doubt and convince us. The most convincing evidence is the one given in the Gospel according to John, again the last of the four Gospels. So the story is developing, and the later Gospel writers are trying to fix the holes in the story. John tells us that Jesus was speared in the side, and if one wants to know what killed Jesus, one thinks, the spear thrust. But now we know that that's not historical. It is John's invention into the story, and the original story leaves a doubt that Jesus actually died on the cross. God wasn't deceiving the disciples of Jesus. The Gospels themselves say that the disciples forsook Jesus and fled. And if they knew that Jesus was not in God's protection, they would not have forsaken him and fled. The disciples of Jesus probably knew that Jesus was rescued by God and raised to heaven. The Quran actually in Surah 3 verse 54 says that God raised Jesus to heaven, and the commentary on that by Imam As-Suyuti shows that God actually showed the disciples of Jesus a vision of Jesus from heaven so that they can be solaced and be comforted, and they could know that God has actually raised Jesus. So in that case, it is not a Muslim belief that God deceived the disciples of Jesus. But the Jews, the opponents of Jesus at the time, who wanted Jesus dead, they themselves felt that they were being deceived. And in fact, in that case, the tables were turned on them. They tried by hook or crook to get Jesus crucified, but in fact they did not succeed, and God actually raised his man to heaven. So to say that God was deceptive, I don't think is correct. That's not the Muslim belief at all. Moreover, when the Quran speaks about God making the disciples of Jesus victorious, there are various statements which David has actually amalgamated together, but taking them one at a time. Surah 61, Surah 61's verse does not necessarily mean that all of the followers of Christianity are, with all of their false doctrines, are approved by God. It's saying that the original disciples of Jesus, who were the Ansar Allah, the helpers of God, they are made victorious in a particular way. And then there could be another broader way in which Christians in general, believing in Jesus, are made to be more prevalent than those who disbelieved in Jesus and rejected him and tried to get him crucified. So neither was God being deceptive, nor was he aiding the wrong crowd. He was aiding the monotheists who, with their faults, were monotheists at the time.
Thank you, Dr. Shabir. And we're going to reset the clock for David for 7 minutes for his first rebuttal. And we're getting ready for that clock, and we are ready to go in just a couple seconds, and you may start now.
Thank you, Shabir. In my opening statement, I drew attention to 7 facts. The Quran states that Jesus was a messenger of Allah and a prophet of Islam. The Quran states that Jesus won a number of followers who were Muslims. In the Quran, Allah promises Jesus that his followers will be superior to unbelievers until the day of resurrection. If there were any first century Jews who converted to Islam due to Jesus' preaching, they didn't last very long. We have no record of their existence. According to Islam, Allah corrupted the gospel through the power of illusion, deceiving people into believing that Jesus died on the cross. The Quran states that Allah helped spread a corrupt version of Christianity. If he's the one helping the followers, then he's helping spread their message. And the Quran states, Quran affirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Christian scriptures. So let's look at some of Shabir's responses. One, since the issue of the crucifixion is so crucial, I want to draw attention to an inconsistency in Shabir's method. If Shabir finds anything that any scholar has said that he can use to attack some Christian doctrine, he'll use that. But if there's a consensus among scholars on some issue and it disagrees with Islam, it's as if the scholarship doesn't matter. So let's take an example, Jesus' death by crucifixion. We'll go through some non-Christian scholars, and those of you who follow scholarship on early Christianity know who these guys are. Atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann says that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Well, why is Shabir disputing it? John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar says that there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, states that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid concludes that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically certain. Notice they're not saying, yeah, we have some reason to think it. They're certainly not saying, well, what probably happened is that Jesus survived and then was raised from the tomb. According to Paula Fredrickson, a convert to Judaism, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. And as everyone's favorite scholarly critic of Christianity, Bart Ehrman, maintains, one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Notice, it's one of the most certain facts of history. It's indisputable. These are the things these scholars are saying with one united voice. Why don't these scholars matter now? Why is it only when they're saying something critical, but when they're agreeing with some Christian doctrine, their position is meaningless? Now, Shabir says that I've mixed Islamic commentaries with my view of the Quran. That's true, but it's commentary that goes back to Muhammad and his companions on I think 9 of the earliest 10 versions of what happened at the cross. All involve substitution. There's one that just doesn't say. So Shabir pointed out that this is everywhere in Islam. And so if that's the doctrine that became dominant in Islam, it seems that Shabir is doing something similar in Islam and Christianity. He's assuming that for decades, the people who are spreading the message just have no input, and anyone could come in and just change whatever they want, and that what actually gets down to us has nothing to do with the original message. Well, if Allah tells us something in the Quran, and Muslims later tell us exactly what he means, you better have some very good evidence if you go against that. Now, Shabir, he says that in response to whether God being deceptive, just keep in mind, he acknowledged that this is the dominant Muslim view. So according to the dominant, most popular Muslim view, Allah tricked and deceived people by making someone else look like Jesus on the cross. But then Shabir goes on to say, perhaps God allowed Jesus to appear to his followers to comfort them. Well, that didn't have the impact that God wanted. Didn't Allah know that they're going to conclude that Jesus rose from the dead? Because that's what they concluded. Let me go through some non-Christian scholars again on how certain it is that Jesus' followers became convinced that he rose from the dead. Gerd Ludemann, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Bart Ehrman, we can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples at some later time insisted that he soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead. Bart Ehrman again, it is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his execution. So notice, again, they're not saying, hey, we have some good reason to think. We can say it's probably true. They're taking this as historical fact and historically certain, one, that Jesus died by crucifixion, and two, that his followers, his original followers, became convinced that he had appeared to them, risen from the dead. Now, according to the dominant view in Islam, where did Christians get the idea that Jesus died by crucifixion? We got it from Allah. We got it from Allah. So that would be Allah making us think something that's completely false. And according to Shabir, where did Jesus' followers get the idea that he had been raised from the dead? They got that idea from Allah, who allowed Jesus to appear to them, knowing that they're going to conclude that he had appeared to them risen from the dead. He had appeared to them as the risen Lord. So where does these doctrines come from? You can't blame the Apostle Paul, ladies and gentlemen. You can't blame the Council of Nicaea. This is Allah doing things that he has to know. He has to know that these things are going to corrupt Christianity. And so Shabir says, I lack critical thinking skills because I'm not being critical of these sources. Well, that's not true. I'm pointing out what all of the sources have in common. All of the sources agree Jesus died by crucifixion. All of the sources agree that Jesus rose from the dead. All of the sources agree that Jesus is the Son of God. So here we're taking all of these sources that agree on these basic Christian doctrines, and I'm pointing out the fact that if all of these sources agree and they're all wrong, then Jesus was a complete failure. His followers were complete failures. God tricked people, and Christianity was corrupted, and God couldn't do anything to stop it because he's part of the problem. He's part of the cause of the deception. So if you want to say all of this has been corrupted, that's fine, but think about what you're saying about God and what you're saying about Jesus and what you're saying about the followers. It's not good, ladies and gentlemen, and this is Islam.
Thank you, David. And we just got through our first rebuttal from each gentleman, each debater, and now we're going to give Shabir 5 minutes for your second rebuttal. We're getting the clock reset here. And we're getting close, and you can start right now.
Okay, so David seems to be repeating many of the points which I've already answered, and it's interesting to have a debate going in this way because it almost sounds like, a dialogue of the deaf. Like we have to listen to each other, and if a point is already answered, we don't raise it again, unless you want to engage that answer and then look at a different aspect of it. Now, David is saying that God is deceptive following from the Islamic view, but in order for him to be consistent, he has to make points against Islam that do not rebound on Christianity. For example, what do we say about God being deceptive? The book of Jeremiah in the Bible says, Yahweh has deceived me and I was deceived. So that's the Bible's prophet saying that God deceived the prophet himself. In the New Testament, it says that God will send them strong delusion. So God sends delusions on people, and even a lying spirit, according to the Bible, God will send on people. So is God being deceptive in the Bible too? So deal with your own source before you come to deal with the Quran. But from the Quranic perspective, I wouldn't say that God was being deceptive here. God allows the flow of history of events, and people became deceived through that flow of events. Those who wanted by hook or crook to crucify Jesus, they were the ones who were deceived by the circumstances. They thought that they waited and witnessed Jesus dying on the cross. Jesus expired. The Sabbath was approaching. The Jews left to go and observe their Sabbath. And then later on they heard that the body was taken down. They didn't expect that. So even on the Sabbath day, they violated the Sabbath rules to go into the court of Pilate to say to him that you should seal up the tomb to make sure that Jesus doesn't get out. Otherwise, his followers may come steal his body and then tell people that he resurrected from the dead. And then the second deception will be worse than the first. So they felt that they were being deceived in this circumstance. Now, it says that Pilate ordered for the tomb to be sealed. And the soldiers went and they sealed the tomb, but it doesn't say they checked to see if the body was still in there. So the body could have gone missing even on the Friday night, and they're sealing an empty tomb. Nobody is said to have checked. So what we have is that in the final analysis, the story which was actually written to convince us that Jesus actually died on the cross and resurrected from the dead does not convince us once we examine it with a critical eye. And the best rendition of this is to say that God rescued Jesus and raised him to himself. David is asking, well, what does the Messiah accomplish? It looks like he's a failed Messiah in the Muslim view. Jesus failed. But in fact, the Quran is supporting a victorious Messiah. If we follow the biblical thinking on this, the Gospels represent Jesus as the Messiah, son of David. If he was the Davidic Messiah, then he had to sit on the throne and rule instead of the Romans. He had to actually drive out the Romans and seize power from them. But he never did that. Christians say, okay, when he comes back, he will do that. And the Jews are saying, okay, when he comes back and he does that, then we'll believe he's a true Messiah. But so far, it looks like he's the false Messiah, Because if he was to be the true Messiah, he had to sit on the throne. He didn't sit on the throne. He's a false Messiah. He hung on the cross instead. Christians say, but God vindicated him by raising him from the dead. But if to all appearances he's the false Messiah, why would God raise him from the dead, thus vindicating him privately, whereas publicly to all of the Jews, God made him appear to be the false Messiah, so the Jews can go away laughing, ha ha ha, we crucified the so-called Messiah. The Quran answers that by saying, Ma qataluhu wa ma salabuhu. They killed him not, nor did they crucify him. The Quran is actually defending him and saying, no, you guys did not succeed, you did not kill him. And in any case, the Quran does not represent Jesus as the Davidic Messiah. So the Quran does not have this internal contradiction. That internal contradiction is there in the Gospels, which, when studied carefully, makes Jesus appear to be the false Messiah. Now, why do I not agree with all of these scholars when they say that Jesus definitely died by crucifixion? These scholars are, I agree with them from a historical point of view. This is what historians have to say. But they're starting with the assumption that Jesus did not rise from the dead. E.P. Sanders, in his book Paul, says, once we take into the consideration the idea that Jesus resurrected from the dead, we have to ask, how do we know he was dead in the first place? And that's the problem for Christianity. See, all these historical scholars, whether Ludemann or Crossan, they're starting with the assumption Jesus was dead and buried, and perhaps his body was eaten by dogs, and that's the end of him. No resurrection from the dead. Disciples may have believed, some of them, according in your own words, Bart Ehrman said, some of them, not necessarily all of them, but they believe that's not necessarily true. So from that perspective, he died, buried, that's the end of him. From the Quranic and Christian perspective, God raised him.
Oh.